All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, October 13th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream. Sorry, I'm just a couple minutes late here. A lot of excitement going on in Slack here today. Lots of interesting conversations, so I got distracted and forgot that I needed to hop on stream and start talking to you guys live here. If this is your first time watching the stream, this is a live open Q&A style show where I answer questions from SaberSim users about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. We've got some awesome questions here in the queue today. Definitely one here that has sparked a lot of conversations back and forth in the Office Hours channel about single entry versus multi-entry contest selection. But I got a few questions about overfitting rules and like overvaluing correlation stacking rules and things like NFL that I'm excited to talk about. A couple other questions here too about things like, let's see, min salary, which is a good one here, and a question here about stack types that may need a little bit more information. So maybe you guys can help me make sure I understand this question correctly. But as always, feel free to fire off any questions that you have. We do these shows live for a reason. So I am here to answer your questions and then also answer your follow-up questions. So if you have follow-up questions, if something I'm saying isn't making a lot of sense, feel free to shout it out. Also, you know, if you just have thoughts or an opinion about whatever we're talking about, always feel free to go ahead and let me know. We'll pull them up on stream. Let's go ahead. I'm going to get started with things in the order that these questions came in here. So I did briefly just want to touch on this one here. This is from Rough 'em Up, and I think I'm a little bit confused here, to be completely honest. So maybe anybody that is reading this question a little bit better than I am can help me out. But the question says, question for tomorrow's office hours, is it possible to add a tab that shows the stack combo percentages? This would be useful in MLB and NHL to see out of the stacks how much allocation is a particular combo getting, or is there a way to do this currently? So there is. We'll go ahead. Let's pull up the app here, and since you mentioned NHL, we'll do NHL. So let's pull up tonight's slate, and we'll just build a few lineups. But the stack types tab in your post build settings is built to do exactly this. So let's go ahead. We'll just run a build here. We'll assume, you know, something like, I guess the quarter jukebox would be like something like this. We'll do a quick build and we'll look at our stack types and go ahead and see what we get here. So we'll run a few lineups here. Don't need a ton of lineups in the pool. That is plenty. So again, we have the stack types tab here, and that is basically going to show you your different stack combinations here. So let's edit 2 projections just so we can see everything here. Obviously, correlation, hockey is a high correlation sport, but there is quite a diversity of different stack types we're getting. Lots of different ways to stack teams up here, but we've got like big full 6-team stacks, 4-2s, a couple 2-2-2s, some smaller stacks, 4-3s, a variety of different stacks coming through, and that's basically why this is here, to do exactly that. And then of course you can obviously edit your exposure. Maybe you don't want to play stack types that are as small as 2-2-2s, so you can just remove these kinds of lineups from your pool. Maybe make sure that you are just getting lineups that at least have a 3-stack or something like that. You know, whatever feels appropriate to you. So rough them up. If you end up watching this back, and I have this general sense that I didn't get at some part of this question here, or that there was something else you were referring to. So if that is the case, just let me know. Happy to talk about this again later. Bring this question back up. I'm going to hit this question real quick from Marco that I just saw come in YouTube chat here. He said GPP correlation, keep it at 10 or the highest setting, and then commented NFL. So looking over at NFL, a quick note on the sliders in general, we get a lot of questions about where should you set your sliders. These sliders, first of all, when you pull up your build lineups page, and you select GPP and you select your contest, right? So let's say let's say you're playing the quarter jukebox, right? And correlation goes to high, to 6. So these default sliders, what we call them, these have been set at these values by building literally tens of thousands of lineups thousands or tens of thousands of lineups at every single individual slider combination, and then comparing the expected value of those lineups, or calculating the expected value of those lineups compared to past contests that actually ran. So in other words, these are data-driven, back-tested sliders that are optimized for the exact contest you tell us you're playing. So I would recommend leaving them alone, to be completely honest. I don't think you need correlation as high as 10, even in a high correlation sport like NFL. I think correlation at 6, you'll find that you are getting a lot of those nice correlations that you want, those good solid stack types and everything. Here, we can even just build a few lineups here. We'll just build 100 real quick, but we'll use the default sliders. And what we'll see here is that we're going to get the nice solid GPP NFL kind of stacks that we're hoping for. Probably a mix of QB plus 1, QB plus 2, QB plus 3, some other mini correlations, micro stacks probably mixed in there, and things like that. And that is without setting a single rule. That's just using the default slider settings. So again, always recommend just leaving the sliders alone. It's probably the last place you really want to go to add value. I know there's been a few times where people have said, they're running tests to compare actual scores or trying to back test to a certain slate or something like that and seeing what was optimal. We have built more lineups at every combination of slider setting than you really realistically could do maybe in a lifetime of playing DFS, and set them where they belong. So again, right, didn't set a single rule, just let correlation go where it is. And we have QB plus 2, 1 run back, QB plus 1, 1 run back, QB plus 3 with 1 run back, and then QB plus 1, 3, 2 with no run backs. The reverse stack here with the QB plus 1 with 2 on the opposing team. So all good there. But Marco said, okay, great. Yep. Let me know if you have any other questions there or any follow-up for me. Happy to talk about this stuff more here in depth. So let's go ahead and I did see there was a comment from Wise Guy here that said a follow-up on that last question here, I assume. I think he's asking if the team combo percentages can be displayed like FC. I maybe will need a screenshot, actually, of exactly what you're referring to. Even a long time ago, before my SaberSim days, I was never an FC user. So I'm not entirely sure how their stack presentation looks. You can see, I'm sure everybody's familiar here with the team stacks, game stacks, stack types tab. I feel like there's generally a pretty clean breakdown here of the way that the stacks are organized. But if there's something additional here that I'm missing, would definitely be interested in seeing a screenshot of what you're trying to do. It's definitely possible that there is a way to see it here in the app. And it's also entirely possible that there isn't, and it would be useful for us to see it and maybe think about an improvement to our stack type presentation in the future. So anyway, I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to this next question here. This is the contest selection question. And before I jump in here, so this question really, TMB kind of here put together a very interesting kind of screenshot, or I guess it's not a screenshot. It's a real life screenshot. It's a picture of some calculations of profitability for single entry contests versus multi-entry contests. There is now a 78 reply chain and counting between a few other people in the community, which is awesome. Like, this kind of conversation and back and forth is great, especially for something that's a little bit more meta and less like, what players should I play? What teams should I stack? This stuff is great. So if you're interested in this conversation, I definitely recommend just going in and reading this whole reply chain. For now, I'm going to just go ahead and kind of summarize this and basically say that the conversation we're having is single entry versus MME, as that's basically the conversation that we're having. And I put together one of my spreadsheets here, and hopefully this will help kind of show at least the way I think about it. And I actually ended up, I had built this spreadsheet. Whoops, let me trying to make this a little bit bigger so people can see it. I built this spreadsheet while this conversation was going on, and then Shady Advice proceeded to basically summarize exactly what I had done here over Slack in a probably more articulate way. So I updated the numbers here to kind of reflect what Shady Advice was using here, but basically the same conclusion. And I mean, let's talk about what I've got here first. So if you've seen these before, I like to make these simplified spreadsheets where we kind of pull off a lot of the extra fat of the reality of DFS and just look at a very simplified example to learn something from it. So we're basically comparing, you have $5 to play. And you're deciding where you want to put that money, and you're really deciding between two options where you can do a 20 max for a quarter each for $5, or you can do a single entry $5 contest. Again, we're going to assume you're going to do this for about 100 slates, more or less, and there's no rake here, right? And it's a winner take all, two assumptions here. So your prize to first in the first case is $250 here. Oh, I should mention there's 1,000 entrants, right? So in this case, $250 to first. And in this case, $5,000 to first, right? I said your probability of winning a slate. Again, I always work with the general assumption here that actually, okay, so let's do this. Let's update this here real quick. So for these to end up showing as a profitable player, I like to work with this very general assumption that you're 2 times better than average expectation. So I think it just makes it a little bit easier to demonstrate. Hold on, I got to fix some of these calculations now. So this is F2 times C. Oops, C2. Okay, now we're good. Okay. So yeah, again, we're going to assume that you're 2 times better than the field, which basically means that your probability of winning any given slate is your number of entries divided by the total number of entries in the contest times 2. Right? Any lineup you play is 2 times more likely than average to win. So this is your probability of winning the slate, and then your average expectations of wins over a season. And if we add in here, I think an important column that is actually missing here is expected value, which would basically be your total average wins over the course of a season times what you stand to win when you win, minus, let's see, your total cost per entry times your number of entries times your number of slates. And what we're going to see here is these are 2 equal on expected value, right? Immediately, again, using this example, this very simplified example, there's no advantage that one contest has over the other, right? We are equally, everything, mostly because everything is kept completely equal here. It's the same number of entries. The prize pool is the same, or I guess it's the same number of entries. Your skill is static. It's the same number of slates, right? It makes sense that this all comes out to an even expected value. But the realization of this expected value is really where the nuance of this conversation comes in. You are going to, on average, realize $250 of first place prize 4 times a slate, 4 times a season if you're playing 100 slates. 4 different times a season, you are going to take down this $250 prize with these assumptions. In the single entry contest, you're going to need to play approximately 5 different seasons, 500 different slates before your average expectation is even winning once. So playing single entry contests, or let me put it this way, playing a single lineup with the money that you have to invest is much higher variance, right? And it's going to take a much longer time for you to realize your edge on average. Now, again, if all you were doing was playing the same $5 every single night, and you were going to do it for every single slate for every sport you play until the end of time, over a very long period of time of playing these slates, your ultimate expected value is going to balance out. But the reality of what actually happens here is that obviously there's a risk of ruin here, right? On one hand, I haven't even considered what your actual potential bankroll is. But theoretically, as your bankroll goes down and you play $5 night after night, and again, this is assuming a winner take all. So as you play $5 night after night and lose and lose and lose and lose and lose and lose, there is a level at which you are out of money, or you have to drop in stakes, and then all of a sudden your expected value, you're never going to really have an opportunity to realize the same expected value you could in the multi-entry contest, right? But on the flip side, in the multi-entry contest, right, you are going to give yourself more opportunities to realize chunks of $250. And should you choose to reinvest that back into your bankroll and allow yourself an opportunity to compound your gains quicker, right? So I did a little bit of a simulation here. This is, I wanted to go further with this. I ran out of time. This is super basic. I'm aware that this is super basic. But all we are doing here is we're in basically for contest 1, the multi-entry contest, randomly generating a number between 1 and 50, which is our, that's actually not even right. 1 in 50 is a 2% chance. So basically, actually, you're break even. So actually, the way I did this so it's actually 1 in 25, right? I have the number wrong here. 4%. 1 divided by 25. Yeah, I'm crazy. Okay, so let's actually change this. So 1 divided by 25, right? And pull this down. Right, because we're 2 times better than the field. It's more fun if we're profitable. That's why I always make the assumptions that we're profitable, because it's more fun that way. So let's do 1 in 500 here. Okay. And let's pull this down. Okay. So we can run this sim, right? And again, all we have to do is refresh the spreadsheet. So we can basically just say sim, and refresh it, right? And it's basically going to pull a random number generator between 1 and 25. If it's 1, we win first. If it's not, we win 0, right? And we can see, again, just 100 slates. Our expectation is that we're going to get 4 on average over the course of the season. So let's actually zoom this out because I have it color coded. So it's easy to see just the colors, right? I know this is going to be super small for you guys, but now we can just see the colors, right? So this season we won 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, okay, so we hit our average expectation, right? And for contest 2, we didn't win once, right? So basically had a perfectly average season here, right? But again, in reality, we now have this extra $1,000 that we're going to be able to go into the next sport or the next season and reinvest. We've had an opportunity to realize some of our gains already just over the course of 1 season. Whereas in contest 2, right, we are really still 4 more seasons away before we even expect to have our first win. Now, there's eventually, probably we could do this for long enough that eventually your variance is going to go in your direction and you're going to bank contest 2. But on average, it's going to take a while for us to do this before we see one, right? And variance can be pretty cruel for just playing a single contest. Right? It could take a long time for this to come up. We're basically going to, there's one. So again, it was about the 5th or 6th season. I'm not sure how many times we did this, but we took it down, right? And again, like law of large numbers here, the longer we do this, the more your expected value of both of these contests is just going to condense around $500 if we were to actually sum this up and add this up correctly. But that's not really what we're doing here. And all this stuff actually takes place in reality, where your bankroll is finite and maybe you can't stand to lose 5+ seasons consecutively playing a single lineup every single slate, right? And also on the flip side, we're playing with, in reality, where a $250 boost to your bankroll allows this, actually, say you won the $250 prize on slate 12, it actually allows you an opportunity to reinvest this on slate 13 if you wanted to, right? So you have an opportunity to compound that to build the bankroll faster. And that's really what it comes down to. And again, is the expected value is the same over a long period of time, but your variance is much lower in the multi-entry contest, and you give yourself less risk of ruin, right? Shady Advice brought up the Kelly criterion, right? You can actually, this actually would actually even be inefficient gambling, really, because you wouldn't want to bet the same amount of money with this higher variance approach. But regardless, this multi-entry approach is going to give you a lower variance, less risk of ruin, and give yourself a greater opportunity to compound on winnings faster and move up in stakes and get more action going more quickly over even just a very short period of time. So I put together, let's see, I blocked out some thoughts here, but I wanted to, okay, so I guess, yeah, let's talk about this here. So really, in reality, let's now moving from the theoretical more to the reality side of things, I'll make this a little bit bigger again so people can read this. Oops. So obviously, when you're actually picking contests and deciding what to play, right, there's more that comes in here. And there's a lot of things that we just haven't even been considering in this example. So, what contest has more effective entrants? This contest actually doesn't have very many effective entrants, and maybe isn't actually a very good contest to play if the people in this contest are skilled, and the skilled people in this contest are taking up a lot of lineup equity, right? Which contests are under $3 to enter? On the flip side, this contest in reality is over $3. All of the sharks and players with $1 million or more in lifetime winnings can enter this, and maybe that affects the overall softness or lack thereof of this contest, whereas this one's under $3, and maybe it makes this contest a little bit easier to win. Obviously depends on how many people are maxing the contest out, right? At the very low stakes, 25 cents, it's not a very big deal for people to max this contest out. A lot of people in the contest are going to be maxing it out. As you move up in stakes, it becomes more difficult. There are going to be more people probably maxing out the mini max than the milli maker every single week, because there's a difference of a few $1,000s to max one out versus the other. This is a really good point too. Shady Advice brought this up in that long comment thread here. But how skillfully are people maxing contests out, right? Are the people building 20 lineups, building 20 good lineups? Do people have the skills to do that? Most people that are familiar with DFS, that are at least not playing their very first slate, have some idea of what maybe a good single lineup might look like. Maybe not. But most people do. They may not have a very good sense of what 20 good lineups looks like, even if they're using an optimizer. Obviously, we assumed no rake here and a winner-take-all payout structure, but these are considerations too. There are bad payout structures, and there are contests that have more or less rake than others. So all these things are other considerations. But again, like, why do we recommend, and I actually want to edit this. It's not even why do we recommend max multi-entry necessarily. It's why do we recommend playing more lineups at lower dollar amounts, right? That's really the key here. And why do we do that? Even if this number is the same, it's more reliable to build your bankroll, as we just saw here, because the variance is lower. But then secondly, I think this point here is actually huge, right? Oops, I'm going to burn somebody's eyes out here. Let's do a much softer green here. This point here matches this one, right? And we talk about this a lot in our in our strategy sessions. But the field is really bad at building multiple good lineups, right? People have a pretty good sense, especially, people have a strong sense in NFL. You're building a single lineup by hand. You stack your quarterback with a pass catcher or two. Even the sites, if you go on FanDuel now and use the Guru Suggestions tab, that's how I do all my dummy entries on FanDuel. So that's how I know this. But it'll actually just stack for you. If you literally just enter a contest on FanDuel and say Guru Suggestions and just click, 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 it'll build you a QB plus wide receiver stack automatically without even having to do a thing, and often also stack some other components of your lineups, right? A lot of people know how to do that in a single entry, but people are pretty bad at multi-entry and don't often know how to build multiple lineups successfuly. So the option then is that that players are left with is they either fail to max out a contest, which means that you have a greater probability of winning that contest. You have greater lineup equity in the contest than those players, or they're entering 20 lineups in a field where 3 of them are profitable and 17 aren't, and it's just dead money that pays the rake, right? So that's another big point there. Let me uncover this here as well. So the other note, though, is that I think what is easy to do here is to get in your head and think, okay, so single entry contests are bad and multi-entry contests are good. And that's not the conclusion. The conclusion, single entry contests here, I've noted it, often do have very high effective entrants and really good payout structures and should be a part of your mix. So if you've seen our contest selection principle videos before on YouTube, you know that we recommend filling in those single entry contests first, right? The $1 single entry, the $5 single entry, the $1 fee maxes, some of those multi-entries, but smaller ones, right? Those are really good contests to play. But the lesson here is that you shouldn't just play one entry anywhere that represents your entire available bankroll for that night, whatever it is, 5%, 2%, 3%, when you could instead drop in stakes and play a lot more lineups, right? So it's not so much a contest selection standpoint. It's more about like how many lineups are you playing? And the more, the better, up until the point of not being able to build profitable lineups anymore, right? Maybe you would be better off if your bankroll was big, playing 150 really great lineups and getting additional action on some of them rather than playing 600 unique lineups. But that's a different conversation. The point is, for the average player up until about 150 to maybe 300 lineups, it makes sense to drop in stakes and play more lineups rather than playing higher stakes and less lineups. All other things being equal. Again, that's like an important part here, right? All other things being equal. And I have one more block here. Okay, so conclusions. Yeah, again, same thing I just said. Spread out your risk. Playing more lineups at lower dollar entries is a lower variance, a safer way to play that doesn't actually sacrifice EV at all, right? And then again, that your contest selection mix should include these single entry contests that grade out very well on a contest selection basis when they're the best contests that you can play. So those are kind of my conclusions here. Again, I think I imagine the conversation is still, it looks like it is. It's we've had 9 more replies since I last checked here. So anyway, I'd recommend if you're interested in reading or hearing about this a little bit more, I'd recommend going in and checking back through that Slack chain. It's an interesting read here. Hopefully this was a little bit helpful. This is kind of just the way I think about it. Again, borrowed heavily from Shady Advice's example here, but I think this is helpful. And then, I mean, I guess the last note I'll make on this is that the reality of this is that this is sometimes, like in reality, when you're picking contests on DraftKings or FanDuel to play, it can be a little challenging, right? It is difficult to know exactly what the best approach is in terms of what should be the greatest consideration. Should I, above all else, no matter what, play the most lineups possible for my bankroll? Well, maybe not. Should I force effective entrants 100% of the time? Well, maybe not. But I mean, should I only play contests that are under $3 and start there, right? Like all of these things actually have value. I was even having this conversation, so I'll give you an example of why this can be hard. And I'll go on to, we'll look at DraftKings real quick, and I'll look at the golf slate for this week, because this is what I was actually looking at. So, let's say that you're playing contests under $50 or something like that. Now, I've entered a few contests for this week, not playing too heavily, but you will find that you are forced to make difficult decisions pretty quickly, right? So you can see, I've fired off into a few single entries because they grade out very well on effective entrants here. So the $1, the $5, the $12, right? And I actually think I'm in the $33 too at the moment. But there is this interesting question of the $1.20 max. It does not have 1,000 effective entrants, but it has 700 effective entrants or so, and it's under $3. Maybe this is a better investment of $20 than playing half of my entry fee into the $33 single entry, right? These are the difficult considerations when you're actually in the real world and having to decide what are the best lineups to play. So I go back and forth here on what the number one priority is. But I think just overall keeping these things in the back of your mind of 1,000+ effective entrants, play contests under $3 when you can first, and play as many lineups as possible at the lowest stakes before moving up, you're going to be in a better spot. And you're at least going to be in a lower variance spot, even if your edge is the same or your expected value is the same in these contests. So anyway, enough on that. Happy to talk a little bit more about that if there are any other questions from anybody. Always a fun discussion. I really like those meta conversations that are about more how DFS is played and how DFS is optimally played, rather than slate specific or even sport specific sometimes conversations. That stuff's really interesting. So anyway, all right, cool. So we'll hit this next question. This is from Nikhil here. And it's a very relevant question about effective entrants. And he said, do you still apply the effective entrants criteria, 1K plus under $3 to less popular sports like hockey? I'm interested in MME contests, and the highest effective entrants you can get on FanDuel right now for NHL is 319. Yeah, that is where it starts to get a little tough, right? Let's hop over to FanDuel. Gets pretty difficult pretty fast on these niche sports. So I'll say a few things. First of all, effective entrance is a valuable metric, a valuable calculation for you to use to determine what contests are the best to play, even if there are none that have 1,000 or more. So if you had decided, for example, that you were going to be playing some hockey, it would be a wise idea. It would be a sharp idea to use the effective entrance metric to determine what kind of contest to play, even if you can't come up with 1,000, right? So again, let's say we're comparing, this is a good example here. We've got this 10 entry max 2380 and this $5 single entry, right? 2380 divided by 20 is 119 effective entrants, and this one is 714, right? This contest is probably going to be a better place to invest your money. And you can use that even on some of these smaller sports where there aren't always contests that have a lot of effective entrants. Now, depending on the next consideration is really how much of a perceived edge or how much of a known edge do you have in the sport. Couch made a really good comment earlier in Slack as well that there aren't a lot of people that actually play NHL very well. There's not as many readily available good NHL projections out there. There's way less good NHL content. There's way less good NHL optimizers, right? Using SaberSim probably gives you all three of those things. You're going to have a greater edge in your hockey contests in theory than the average person that has no idea what they're doing. Whereas the average person that has no idea what they're doing in NFL, to be completely honest, at this point in 2021 is probably stacking, actually. Same thing with baseball, right? The average person in baseball that has no idea what they're doing is probably stacking because it's just so common knowledge now. And maybe in NHL it isn't. And the bar of where you make profitable lineups in NHL or other niche sports is probably lower. So in that case, you can be comfortable with less effective entrants because there's less skilled players in the lobby. The caveat to that is that, or the counterpoint to that is another approach would be if you don't feel like you necessarily have that edge, but you want to play the sport, scale back your bankroll to match, So instead of saying I'm playing, you might be playing 5% in NFL because it's so easy to get so much action down on an NFL slate in just insanely good effective entrance contests that you're just forcing 5%. But maybe if you go over to FanDuel and you're playing NHL tonight, maybe you're playing 1% of your bankroll, right? There's not as many good contests here to play. Maybe you're sticking to, maybe since you're playing contests with lower effective entrants overall, you're playing 1% of your bankroll or 0.5% of your bankroll, right? To account for that. So it just depends on, really those considerations. Like what's your edge in the sport? Or do you have an edge? How big of an edge over the average player do you have? And that will start telling you how to deal with some of these questions, while also keeping in mind that just a very good rule of thumb here is to just play the contests that have the highest effective entrants where you can. So anyway, Nikhil, let me know if that helps answer your question. Again, I think like the most practical, summarizing things, giving the most practical advice I can is still use that calculation as a way to determine what contest to play. And if it is a sport that you feel like your edge is smaller, or that you are closer to the average player, scale back your bankroll. If you feel like your edge is larger and you are much better than the average player, maybe you don't need to do that. And you're just playing the contest with the highest effective entrance possible, but leaving your percentage of your bankroll that you're getting in exactly where it was. So I think Aaron was commenting on this. I feel like this is more better for NHL. I think you might have missed a word there, Aaron. NHL DFS than football. But Jonathan said, very new here. I've noticed that when I create a build, the lineups actually change throughout the day. Is SaberSim changing projections as it gets closer to the slate? For example, I'm playing NHL. There's a few things that can be going on. So we will run sims throughout the day when variety of things can happen for NHL in particular, but confirmed goalies is a good example. Once we've got them confirmed, we will resim the games. We'll resimulate the games thousands of times. We'll update our projections and ranges of outcomes and correlations for certain players. And up here in the timestamp, you'll see the last time we did that. So if significant news is breaking, you can very easily see, you'll see that when you run a build at, 10 a.m. versus 2 p.m., you're going to get different lineups based on the projections updating. But even if you run two builds back to back in a high variance sport like hockey, you are going to get probably very different lineups. The reason why is because our approach to building lineups here has variance naturally baked into it. So you'll see this slider here, sim variance. This is determining in a very direct way here how your lineups are constructed. So what we are doing is, again, I mentioned our projections are unique, that these are not just averages. Well, they are averages, these projections here, but they actually are just a way of visualizing a full range of outcomes of any given player based on what happens in our thousands of game simulations for this game. And that's true of every player here. When we have Patrick Kane's projection, right, we say he's projected on average for 11.53, but in reality, we have thousands of simulations of this particular game, and this is what his full range of outcomes looks like across all those simulations, right? When we build your lineups, we will take random buckets, random groupings of game simulations, pull out that player's average across that group of game simulations, and use that as every player's projection every single individual time we build a lineup. So we build lineup 1, we'll pull a random set of game simulations, set the player projections for building that lineup to whatever they scored on average in that set of game simulations, build the best lineup based around that, based on correlation and ownership fade, and then move on to the next lineup with a different random set of game simulations. The higher sim variance is, the smaller that bucket gets. So at 10, we're actually just using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player every time we build a lineup. If it were ever at 0, we would just use the average projection for every player when we build the lineup. And the value of this, why this is so powerful, in fact, I think this is probably the single most powerful thing behind SaberSim, is that it is allowing the natural variance of the game and the player's real ranges of outcomes to bring diversity and variance and upside into your lineups. You're not optimizing for ceiling projections, right? And you're not using a random variance of random. You're not using like a traditional randomness like you might see on a traditional optimizer that just assumes every player is normally distributed. What you're actually doing is you're picking out random buckets of game simulations, getting these real ranges of outcomes, real upside into your lineups, and building lineups accordingly. So I'm coming around to my point here, I promise. Ultimately, then, the reason why if you run 2 builds completely back-to-back, you may get different lineups, you may get slightly different, you may get different exposures, is because the way that your simulations are randomly grouped when building every single individual lineup will change a little bit just because it is random. The higher your sim variance slider, the more likely your lineups and players and exposures are to be different in between builds. But again, while that is a little bit of a new idea, especially for people that are used to building on traditional tools, that maybe we're used to building on traditional tools with no randomness applied, it is reflective of the variance of the individual game you're playing, and it's ultimately a good thing. It makes your lineups stronger. So Jonathan said, so does it make sense to use the simulation that was run closest to the slate start? Yes, it does. I would not go so overboard with that to put yourself in jeopardy of missing lock. I typically start my builds for any sport no later than 30 minutes before lock, just so I know I have enough time to do everything I might want to do with editing projections or exposures and getting things actually in. But you should wait to make your final lineups as close as you can to lock. And also for a sport like hockey, pay attention after lock, right? And late swap as needed. It's definitely possible that we don't have confirmed goalies for some of these late games, right? Tonight, 5-game slate locks at 5, my time here, the 1 game at 5:30, and then 3 games at 8, right? It's possible we don't have confirmed goalies for these teams. It's possible line changes could happen here during the slate that would change projections again. So just keep in mind the potential need to late swap if sims rerun throughout the slate. The one other recommendation I would say is join up into our Slack community. There is a link to join the Slack community in the description of every past office hours video. So I know you're watching this one live. At the moment, it has no description. It will have a description later this afternoon once I post it. But if you look at any of the past office hours videos on our YouTube channel, you'll find a link to join Slack there. In Slack, there is a channel one called NHL, which is great for talking NHL strategy with the folks that play NHL here a lot. But there's also another one called NHL Lineup Alerts, which will actually show you every single time a sim for any game starts and finishes. So while this last updated can be really useful, it'll show you the last time we changed anything here. In the NHL lineup alerts channel, you get to see when sims for specific games start and finish. So it can be pretty useful, I guess, especially if you're waiting for a specific game to update to check on that channel. But welcome anyway, Jonathan, and great questions. All right, cool. Okay, so Wise Guy sent over a screenshot showing what FC does with the stacking rules. So it looks like it's basically a way to see a combination of a stacking rule and a team. So again, I assume I'm going to make an assumption that that is kind of what you're looking for here. There's a few different ways to do that. I mean, one is to, just go in looking at the team stacks. You can see, for example, like what teams am I 4 stacking? It's only Vancouver. What teams am I 5 stacking, right? You can also use the filters though and say like, so I don't have the screenshot's on Slack, so I don't have it up in my browser, but let's say you wanted to see like what the team compositions were on the lineups that let's get more lineups in here too, so we can see this like with more lineups. What are the team compositions that I've used in my 4-3 stacks? So you could filter by 4-3 here, which is only going to show you your 4-3 stacks, and then go back to team stacks. And then you can see, these are the teams that are showing up in those individual stacks. But if I wanted to see like what are the teams that are getting 4 stacked in my 4-3 stacks, you could do it like this. So you could say, I filtered by 4-3 here, and now I'm viewing what teams are getting used in the 4 stacks, right? Between your combinations of different tabs here and also the filters, you can get quite a bit of nuance here, or maybe not. I say nuance too much. People make fun of me sometimes about it after the stream, but not nuance. You can get a high degree of like precision here, I guess is a better word, of really looking deep into what individual combinations of stacks you have are. But that is probably my best advice there of the best way you could do that. So, cool. Okay, so I remember there were a few other questions here that I saw come in. Okay. So there was a question from Philip here that came in through support, and it was about min salary. So you'll see here on step 2, there's this min salary option. This is going to vary a fair bit, sport to sport, slate to slate. Sports where higher, where let me put it this way, I guess, where sports where average projection is more important, and players' salaries are more often correlated with their projection, we are going to have a higher value here to encourage lineups to be built with higher salaries, right? Using more of the salary, because using less salary is sacrificing average projected points. So sports in particular, where this is a lot higher, are typically NBA and NFL. Higher variance sports like NHL and baseball, right? This is going to come down a little bit more. Super high variance contest types like single game for NHL. Or single game for NFL, very high variance game type. This comes all the way down to like 35,000, right? Because the variance of a single game of football is so high that this by default is going to be down here to allow you to build more unique lineups of different compositions that still have win equity, but don't need to be built at the maximum salary. I never touch this, pretty much never. So I don't think it's something that you really need to pay too much attention to. I would say if you had any urge to mess with this at all, I would only really ever think about lowering it, because at the end of the day, SaberSim is not going to build you bad lineups, right? It's not going to build you lineups that have no win equity in contests. So my only thing that hops into my mind here is that this actually could be a bit limiting, even at 35,000 for potentially a sport like NFL. I would say most of the lineups that you're going to be built you're going to be building for this particular slate, for example, would be well over 35,000 salary. But it would be interesting to me to like set this much lower, or even just zero it out and then see if there were any lineups that did get built at a much lower salary. But again, I think it's pretty unlikely. And it's set about where it should be for every contest, or for every individual sport and slate type. I think you'll find that rarely are lineups going to be built right at the edge of where your min salary is anyway. Like you can see, we are doing some lower salary builds here for Showdown, but nothing's like so super low, because there aren't profitable lineups that can be made at that low of a salary, right? So I think also for the main slate, where it does come up a little bit higher, we have it set at what? Wait a minute. There we go. We have it set at 49.5 here. Again, like I think it would be interesting. I'd be curious just to drop it to 0 and see what we get out of this here. But for main slate GPPs for football, I think you're going to find that most of your lineups are built using a lot of the salary anyway, because using less salary just sacrifices too much in raw projection to be worthwhile. So you're rarely going to have those lineups with a very low salary, even if you take that min salary off. I want to see what this looks like here, and then we'll wrap this up. Okay, so yeah, I mean, the first lineup is literally max salary, 49.9, max salary, 49.8, 49.7, max, 49.9, right? Like, again, it's the same deal here. The builder is really recognizing that the optimal strategy is to use as much salary as possible, because you give up too much in terms of raw points by going under that max salary. So while the min salary here of 49.5 or whatever it is a nice backstop to prevent certain lineups from showing up, it doesn't do a lot. And I wouldn't sweat lowering this or basically just ignoring it most of the time for almost any sport. So, but a good question though. And I know a lot of these, it's funny, a lot of these settings I know definitely look like, when you're maybe new to SaberSim, like they are just begging to be edited. And the reality is that we've worked very hard on what the defaults are for all of these things. So while we always want people to have as much control as possible to fine tune their process and make things a little bit better for them, almost always when there's a question about what should I do with this particular setting in step 2, it almost always ends up being, from me at least, leave it where it's at, because it's best where it's at. But definitely a good question there. So let's see. There was one other. I saw another question. This actually came in the NFL channel, and this was from Pratik. I'm going to just answer this real quick because I have the time to do so. He said, is there a way to avoid having 2 running backs from the same team in your lineups? There is, and you would just want to set a rule to prevent it. So what I would do is set an advanced stacking rule. Oh, actually, I have 2 more questions. So I'm glad I have 48 minutes here. So I have another question in my queue. I forgot about it. This just made me remember. But if you go over to stacking and then advanced, and then add an advanced rule, and what we are going to say is we're going to edit the positions here, and we're going to say running back less than or equal to 1 running back, and save. So this is from one team, right? So we are saying use less than or equal to 1 running back from the same team. And that's it. Simple as that. There's no other rules we want to set here, but that is the easiest way to do that. And that will make sure that that's done. So, okay, cool. So I did final question here, and this one's this is an interesting one. This doesn't actually have to be the final question, I guess. If there's more questions, feel free to fire them off, but it's the final question for now. And this was from Pippin here. And he said, Just wanted to get your take on overfitting when building lineups. Everyone always asks about all these rules to build lineups like they're used to in traditional optimizers, but no one ever asks what happens when you use those rules on a simulation-based builder. In short, if someone is going to use stacking rules, would it be prudent to dumb down correlation or even variance, especially in a build with max variance that will be correlated just by the nature of things? Okay, so I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think this is a really great question. And I mean, the first thing I was going to note is that, a very common question we get from people, let's go back to this build here. We built this one on essentially default settings, there's a variety of, actually, let's do a much bigger build here. So let's do 1,500 lineups because I want to talk about a couple things here. So this question was posed from the lens of setting stacking rules and like overfitting your lineups. And I think that is definitely one way to look at this. But really the ideas here are even true about just stack types in general, right? Let's assume, for example, that Saber score was 100% accurate, which it isn't. But that when you built a pool of 1,500 lineups like I'm doing here, the top 150 lineups that you got were legitimately the highest expected value lineups in the pool, right? There's going to be a variety of stack types in there. There are probably going to be some large, big stacks, some large game stacks. There are probably going to be some small stacks. If we're lucky, we might even get a lineup that isn't stacked at all, at least in the conventional way of thinking, with a QB plus a pass catcher. We've seen that before here on stream, where especially for some of these running quarterbacks, you get sometimes lineups that are Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, QB plus 0 lineups, right? And the builder in that particular case is indicating to you that those are the best, the highest expected value, the most optimal lineups to play. Those lineups that are not apparently correlated, typically they have other micro correlations in the lineups. They may have a wide receiver that's correlated to another wide receiver on the other team, right? But typically what's happening in those lineups is that there's some other component of the lineup or a sum of other components that is making the builder think the lineup is profitable. So maybe it's particularly low owned, or you're working with a set of game sims that built that lineup where players in the lineup had such high upside, had such high scoring that it outweighed any value of correlation that was showing up in the lineups, right? That's what Saber score is. It is quantifying the combinations of the three components that we think make up a high upside lineup. That's correlation, ownership, and upside. And when you use these kinds of rules that are either like stacking rules or even setting exposures to remove certain stack types, or setting on a traditional optimizer, setting things like ownership sum rules that you can't exceed certain ownership values, you are essentially making a statement that it is not possible that lineup construction could possibly be profitable, or the one of the top 150 most profitable lineups you can build for your lineups, right? And that might be true in certain cases, right? I mentioned here, if we're working with an assumption that Saber score is 100% accurate, you would never make any changes here on step 3. But it isn't, and there are ways to add value here, right? Like you could look at a lineup QB plus 4 with a 2 run back, and I think the win condition of this lineup immediately jumps off the page to everybody. But you might say, for a 500,000 person contest, this lineup isn't plus EV. This lineup is not profitable, and you might eliminate this particular stack type. Or you might generally set a rule in your stack types to say, I don't want lineups that have more than 3 players from the same team, right? Because you don't believe that in general those lineups can be successful. But my point here is that, hang on, I want to review this. I want to look at this question here. My point here is, overall, you are essentially, in some ways, you can define this overfitting of this question as really making any changes whatsoever, right? and that's not really my ultimate conclusion here. I'm not trying to scare anybody off from making any changes in step 3, but it is kind of important to realize what you are doing, like the statement that is actually being made here when you set a stacking rule, when you make adjustments in step 3, anything like that, right? You are making an overall statement that where the builder thinks that because of ownership or raw upside or some other consideration that QB+1 lineup is profitable, is plus EV, then you, by excluding this particular stack type, which I know is another one that people like to remove, you are kind of basically saying that no, correlation needs to be, or apparent correlation needs to be a bigger consideration in what makes a profitable lineup than what the builder gave you. So moving on to kind of the next component of this particular question here is, you know, on the practical side, what should I do if I'm going to make some of these decisions? So let's say you have made the decision that there is a set of profitable lineup constructions that you want to use for your lineups, right? In the form of a stacking rule. And again, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with doing this. So let's say you've decided that maybe it's because you think that this set of lineups is the only ways you can build profitable lineups for the contest. And maybe it's because you think that there is additional leverage that you're getting with these lineup constructions. But in one form or another, you've decided that you are going to stack a QB with anywhere from 1 to 3 pass catchers from the same team and a run back from a player on the opposing team. Let's assume it's a wide receiver and a tight end here in 100% of your lineups, and you've set a stacking rule, right? So what should you do now here with your sliders? That's the question. Would it be prudent to dumb down correlation or even variance? I would say no in this particular case to these questions. One is that when correlation is still up, what it is going to do is it is going to make sure that you are building the best stacks possible, right? We're still going to value the impacts of correlation. So we're going to tell the builder, only build a QB plus 1 to 3 pass catchers and run it back with somebody from the other team, and then feed the builder a correlation weight. So it's going to have the ability to make the decisions of what players to include in the right stacks. What teams make more sense to stack QB plus 1? What teams make more sense to stack QB plus 3? What players it makes sense to include in those stacks? All those things, that is still important. I also wouldn't recommend turning down variance because this is what is allowing, first of all, you to get the right sized player pool and the right kind of exposures out of the gates to certain players. But it also makes sure that you have the right overall upside capabilities in your individual lineup, right? Put another way is we don't want to dumb down the optimizer. We've restricted it in some form by saying only give me lineups of this particular composition, but we don't want to take the tools away from it in the form of the correlation slider and the sim variance slider that make your lineups less correlated or less have less upside overall. So I wouldn't want to do that. Definitely want to leave those sliders up even if you're setting a stacking rule. The final point here is, and I just wanted to touch on it because the last sentence here says, especially in a build with max variance that will be correlated just by the nature of things. And that is true, but I kind of want to explain what this actually means, especially to folks that maybe are unfamiliar with this concept. So again, sim variance at 10 means that we're using single game simulations to determine the projections of each player on every single lineup. So there's actually literally for this particular lineup that we're looking at here, this was built using a single game simulation of every single game on the slate, and then valuing correlation and ownership at the weights that were set on the sliders, and building the best possible lineups that we could, right? But because we were using a single game simulation, right? If this was a lineup where Heineke had a really successful game, in that individual game simulation, some pass catchers had to have been successful. Now, without the correlation slider having a weight at 6, it does not necessarily mean those players would have made it into the lineup, depending on what other players on the slate did. But the point here is that if Heineke was the optimal QB to use for this lineup, we know because it was built with projections from a single game sim that other Washington football team players and pass catchers specifically must have also had a good game. And they are at least have a reasonable chance to show up in the lineup. And that's what this comment is saying here about build with max variance has as correlation just by the nature of things, right? That is also the easier way of thinking about this is on single game showdowns. We often have people ask us why correlation is 0. And the answer is because sim variance is 10. And in an individual game simulation, right, the players that are showing up in the lineups are going to have the natural correlative effects with one another because the projections are all from the same game, right? If you get a lineup where Brady is captain, for example, like you are probably likely going to get some Bucks pass catchers in the lineup most of the time because the game simulations that were used to build those lineups were cases where Brady had to throw the ball to somebody. Or put another way, looking at a traditional player combination that maybe is negatively correlated, if you get a lineup that has Fournette and Ronald Jones in it, right, it's still resting on the strength of a game simulation where both of those players had enough success for their salary to be optimal in the lineup. So, Ross makes a really good point, chimed in here. Speaking of limiting running backs and overfitting rules, Eckler, Chubb, and Hunt all finished as the top 8 running backs on DK last week playing in the same game. Limiting to 1 running back per team or game is not always ideal. Yeah, I think that's a really strong point and a very good example here, right, of the one way, I guess, I'll kind of summarize this here with a few final thoughts. There are a lot of common rules of thumbs in particular for NFL. Like everybody has probably heard of a few, everybody's got a few, and there's new ones like every week and every year, right? I mean, I could probably spout off a few right now. A few common ones that I always hear is that this is one running back per team is a common one. Don't ever play tight end in flex is another common one. Always run back your stacks is another common one. Even more specifically, only QB +2 with 1 run back is a common rule of thumb. The run back should only be wide receivers is a common rule of thumb. Never play 2 running backs playing against each other is a common rule of thumb. Always play a correlated running back with your defense, or not even always. Play 80% of your lineups that have a running back correlated with your defense, right? These are all common rules that are really built on like this average correlation of what players on the average are correlated with one another. But in reality, correlation is only one piece of the puzzle here, right? A lineup can sacrifice some correlation to make that up in low ownership, which is another way of getting raw upside, or sacrifice some correlation to get raw upside potential in the lineup. And that's not even really talking about the fact that the rules of thumbs themselves don't really work that well, right? Like players that you think might be negatively correlated with one another actually are not, or are not as much as you think. But that is really kind of the crux of it here, is that when you're setting these rules, you are maximizing or you are attempting to kind of maximize one particular side of the equation and saying that my best possible lineup based on all these considerations and all these tools that create upside in your lineup cannot possibly be a QB +1, 2. For what? And I, like for what reasoning, right? Is kind of my point overall here. The rules of thumbs themselves were created to make people build better lineups on average for tools that don't deal with the problems of correlation and upside and ownership well. But that's not the case for us here with SaberSim. We don't need to take tools that were designed and rules of thumb that were designed for traditional optimizers and fit them into a tool like SaberSim that knows how to deal with this problem much better. I guess that's actually really my that's my point I'm trying to make. I have really, since this question again was originally written, said more opinion based than anything. So I'm going to give you my overall opinion. I think that the rules of thumb in the DFS world are getting out of control. And I don't think we are here just yet. But I would not be surprised over the next couple years of DFS if a small edge starts to emerge of allowing yourself to build lineups that don't fit into the traditional rules of thumb that people are spouting right now. If you're going to go in and build 150 lineups and force them all to be QB +2 with one run back, I still think that's probably positive EV, because there's still enough of the field that isn't stacking at all, doesn't know to stack, doesn't know how to stack the right way, doesn't understand these correlations, that is still profitable. But as more and more people know that you should just be stacking and watch and read content and listen to content that just says to, force these, I always hear QB +2 with one run back, right? Maybe that particular stack, or to do other things like always correlate your running back with your defense, or always always have a micro stack or a mini stack in the lineup, right? As more and more people do that and force all of their lineups to do that, the win condition of those particular constructions is going to be over leveraged. The percentage of lineups that have those constructions in them is going to be over leveraged compared to how often those constructions win, which is going to create a negative leverage situation. But also people are going to, without realizing it, be sacrificing so much in terms of even just average projection, but in particular upside, or forcing combinations of players that really actually don't have those correlations with one another, or forcing combinations of players that eat additional ownership for no reason. That I think there's going to be this sudden edge that emerges of playing stacks that don't fit into those cookie cutter rules of thumbs. And I almost think we're there. I think we're getting close. And I think with football in particular, we're approaching that, right? The people, like, is this a stack construction that people might get to if they were really focused on fitting the lineup to the rules rather than the rules to the lineup? Probably not, right? This isn't a stack type that I see a lot of people recommending to just jam into optimizers. But again, we're working here with this set of sliders that has been back tested, right? We know that these sliders are optimal because we built more lineups at every combination and compared them to past contests than you could realistically do in 20 seasons of NFL. And we're using game simulations to build the projections. Like, we know that this lineup has upside. And I am trying very hard as I'm moving through the NFL season to listen a little bit more to these kinds of things and not just eliminate constructions of lineups that don't fit my conventional understanding of what makes a successful lineup in NFL. And I was even doing it with MLB a little bit towards the end of the season, right? So anyway, I'll go ahead and leave that there. I hope I didn't get too wordy there or get a little bit, I don't know. I hope I answered that question well. But Bryson said, love the NFL talk. Do you go over PGA projections and variance as well for different tourneys, such as cut versus non-cut, top 5% versus top 10% is mostly based on Vegas odds or custom projections? It's all based on our simulations. So even for golf, right? Let's pull up golf here. CJ Cup this week, no cut event, right? So the players' projections, right? So on a no cut event for golf, we are going to see a much more normal distribution for golfers, right? But when we say Xander is projected at 103.13, again, what we are saying is that his average across every single tournament simulation we have is 103.13. And these percentages are not based on Vegas or anything like that, or even just calculated numbers. These are literally the percent of tournament simulations we have where these outcomes take place. So Xander literally wins the tournament 6.4% of our simulations. Rory comes in the top 10 in 28.9% of our tournament simulations. So again, the more variant the sport is, the more valuable this is. I'm a little bummed that this week is not a cut event, because I think in cut events too, this can even be more powerful. But if we go back, let's just look at like last week's event. We'll actually see that the distributions for golfers look a lot different, right? Because now there's this binary cut event that takes place in the tournament, right? And now we see the distribution looks totally different. We have Webb Simpson's basically his range of outcomes in the event that he misses the cut and his range of outcomes in the event that he makes the cut combines to create his entire tournament distribution. So again, these percentages you're seeing here are depictions or ways to visualize the actual tournament simulations we have. So, all right, cool. I don't see any other questions at the moment. I think I've got through about everything. It was a fun show today. Thanks for everybody that asked questions, participated, was engaging here. It was a good one. We talked about some contest selections, single entry versus multi-entry kind of stuff. Talked a little bit about stacking and also overfitting and just thinking about where our edge and how we find upside in our lineups is. What else did we talk about? We talked a little bit about stack types, visually seeing stack types in the app and all the different ways that we can visualize the way our lineups are put together. So it was a fun show. This is our last office hours of the week that is just open Q&A. Tomorrow at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, we'll be doing our first NBA strategy session, talking about beating NBA GPPs in 2021, what it takes, how to use SaberSim to get an edge in NBA in preparation for next week's opening tip-off on Friday. We'll be doing a similar strategy session, but focusing heavily on showdowns. So look forward to that. But as always, if there are questions about anything else that come up over the course of the end of the week, feel free to email us, support@sabersim.com, or just pop your question into the Office Hours channel on Slack, and we will pick them up there. So looking forward to seeing you guys here all again tomorrow. And take care. See ya.